Thank you, Margot. Can you hear me in the back?
Yes.
Yes? Wow, what a crowd. Thank you for coming out. I have a friend in Washington who is an amateur masseuse. And she once told me that she could put a person to sleep in 15 minutes. And I said, well, I don't in any way want to denigrate your skills, but in 15 minutes I can put a whole bunch of people to sleep. Must be a pretty old pin oak here.
What kind is it?
It's a pin oak.
Oh, wow.
It's an oak and they have these, if you look at the leaves closely, you'll see they're very sharp. They're called pin oaks.
I have no idea.
It's been around for a while. The top looked like it went out a long time ago. Okay.
Okay.
We're rolling, Phil?
Yeah, I think we are. I just want to say thank you for talking to us today.
My pleasure.
My first question is in regard to something you said. You said that we need no less than a wartime effort. Referenced Roosevelt's automobile industry overhaul. If it was up to you, if you were in charge, what would the U.S. be doing right now?
If I were in the White House, I would be doing what Roosevelt did, what were called fireside chats. I'd be talking to the American people, probably on a weekly basis, about another facet of the global environmental sorts of challenges we're facing. It could be the different effects of climate change, the effect on biological diversity, the effect on rainfall patterns. It could be talking about pollutants in the environment and the indirect costs that they represent, how they affect human health, everything from birth defects to respiratory illnesses. I would be pointing out that, we lost more people last year from breathing air polluted by burning coal than we've lost in the last 9 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I would talk about coal, and it's time to go. And we've got to move on to cleaner sources and sources that do not destabilize the Earth's climate. And because of who we are, the United States, we need to lead. Because we're seen as the world leader in so many ways, not just economically, but technologically. If you look at the information technology today around the world, it's the U.S. that leads, whether it's Microsoft way back, or whether it's Google, or more recently Facebook, or whether any of these things. Almost all of them originate in the United States. And we are, in many ways, still the cutting-edge society. But in the climate change issue, we haven't really done that. If I were the president, I'd be talking now about the heat wave in Russia that was centered around Moscow and that reduced their grain harvest by 40%. I don't know if they have 100 million tons, is what they were expecting, to 60 million tons. And I would have pointed out that the world is really lucky, because if that heat wave had been centered in Chicago and not in Moscow, and we had lost 40% of our grain harvest, the world and we would have lost 160 million tons of grain. World grain stocks now would be at the lowest level on record. Grain prices would be going off the top of the chart. There would be extraordinary international competition to try and, among importing countries, which most countries are, to somehow get some grain, get their grain needs taken care of. So this is these are the kinds of things I would be talking about because it's not just climate change, it's price of food. That is the bottom line issue here. I think this will be the first major manifestation of climate change in the world. And I think people need to understand it.
I agree. So I've read that the major objection against Plan B 4.0 is the enormous cost of the changes that you propose. How can political leadership today overcome such an obstacle?
By talking about the cost of not doing it. What's at stake? I mean, as an environmentalist, I and others have been talking for decades about saving the planet. But as I think about it, the planet's probably going to be around for some time. The question now is saving civilization itself. And I don't think civilization can withstand continually rapid climate change. I think the stresses will be too great, whether it's rising food prices or displaced people by rising sea level as a result of the melting of the Greenland ice sheet. I mean, I could see in the not too distant future in this country 2 real estate markets. One in coastal regions where prices would be falling, and one in the rest of the country where prices would be rising, as people suddenly realize that whereas in the last century sea level rose only 6 inches, this century is probably going to be 6 feet. And so if you're investing in coastal real estate, you have to think about these things. And I mean, the idea of having 2 real estate markets in one country, is really an alien thought. We've never had anything like this before. I mean, sometimes markets are stronger in some places than in others, but to have one area where prices are falling and the other where they're rising is a very different situation. And then we have to think about the number of, I mean, if we're looking at rising sea level, we're looking at not just millions, but tens of millions and eventually hundreds of millions of rising sea refugees. And many of them will be crossing national boundaries. And the overwhelming flow will be from developing countries to developed countries. And we can talk about building fences or whatever. Those fences won't mean anything when they're desperate people on a large scale. I was on a book tour several months ago flying into Seattle, Washington, where Boeing's major operations are. I was thinking, 229,000 planes, Boeing couldn't even begin to think about that, anything on that scale right now. But that's what we did in World War II, and it was, I mean, when we entered the war, Europe was almost totally occupied by Nazi Germany. The next stop was the UK. The Japanese, Imperial Japan, had taken over most of Asia, and they were headed for India and Australia. And we turned the whole thing around, and very quickly. But it was because we had leadership and we had a vision and a sense of purpose, and everyone in the country was involved. You know, we were recycling. And as a school kid, we had these little bonds. You get quarters until you get $18.75 worth, and you turn it in, you know, and then 10 years later you get $25 back. I mean, it was amazing how the whole. We had victory gardens. I mean, we're more rural than we are now, but I mean, we were producing 60% of our vegetables in victory gardens, you know? And I mean, it just got everyone involved. We recycled everything in sight. And that's the kind of mobilization that we need now, but it takes a special kind of leadership, and it takes someone who understands what's happening in the world and can relate those things to the things that people are concerned about, like food prices.
The Earth
If you ask shorter questions, I'll give shorter answers.
No, your answers are amazing. Your answers are wonderful. You touched on what was happening in World War II. What role has your generation played in global warming, and what paradigm changes are necessary for the current and upcoming generations to save the world?
Well, my generation and the one before it are the 2 generations since World War II where we've seen this extraordinary growth in affluence and consumption, and the sort of the mindset that we can consume more and more and more and no problems. And then we begin looking ahead and talking about the next generation, our children, our grandchildren.
But what I'm beginning to think is we don't have to wait for them. It's already happening now. And I mentioned the heat wave in Russia. I mean, if someone had told me last spring that the average temperature in Moscow in July of this year would have been 14 degrees above the norm for the month, not for 2 or 3 days, but for the month, to be 14 degrees above the historical average, I would have said, you know, I'm not a climate denier, but that's pushing things a bit far. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe 3 or 4 degrees above average for the month, but 14 degrees? I mean, and it, you know, that heat wave started in late June, went all the way through July and close to mid-August before it finally turned off. And everything was so hot and so dry in Russia that, I mean, the country was literally on fire. They had no way of coping with the fires. Burned easily 25 million acres of forest, for example. They lost who knows how many thousand homes and so forth. In this country, if we have a bad fire year, maybe 1 million acres get burned or something like that. They lost 25 million acres. What was the question?
What paradigm changes
Right.
are necessary?
Well, it's really a fundamental shift. I mean, if I were to put it in broad economic terms, it would be moving from a fossil fuel-based, automobile-centered throwaway economy to an economy that is powered by renewable sources of energy, wind, solar, geothermal, that has a highly diversified transport system, and that reuses and recycles everything. That's the shift we need to make, not over the next half century or century, but in the next matter of years.
Yeah.
It's a real challenge.
Yeah.
Get out your bicycles.
Do we have time for another question? Okay. The Earth Policy Institute has the most comprehensive and interconnected source of data in the world, arguably. What are the major solutions that could make a big difference? Maybe
Well,
the ones that we don't see.
the sort of the principal components of Plan B are, one, to cut carbon emissions 80% by 2020, and that'll take something like a wartime mobilization. Second thing is stabilizing population. Third thing, eradicating poverty, and those two go together, because the more we can accelerate the shift to smaller families, the easier it is to eradicate poverty. And the more we eradicate poverty, the faster the shift to smaller families moves. So those two reinforce each other. And then the fourth one is restoring the economy's natural support systems: the forests, the grasslands, the fisheries, the aquifers, the soils. I mean, we're destroying them pretty fast right now. Half of us live in countries that are overpumping aquifers, and there are many countries now where, because of overpumping, we've expanded food production artificially. And when the aquifers are depleted, the rate of pumping will necessarily be reduced to the rate of recharge. We're now pumping much faster than they recharge, which is why water tables are falling. But once they hit bottom and the aquifers entirely pumped out, then you can't pump beyond the rate of recharge, so there'll be a sharp downward adjustment. And that's occurring in big countries like India and China, for example, and a lot of people. I don't think we're quite prepared for what's coming. I'm not talking about 2050, I'm talking about the next couple of years.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.